Alan here. So I realized that I promised a second tutorial video on bow control, but I haven't really thought out what I would like to discuss or demonstrate in that video. After talking to a friend yesterday on topics or questions many beginners have, I realized that many beginners often question what bow to pick, what violin to pick, or what strings to use. So this is what I'm going to discuss in this video. So as you can see, I have two violins with me right now, the two extremes I want to compare. The cheap violin I have, which I won in a competition worth about $100. It also has Lindsay's signature on it. Or my performance violin, which is worth probably 100 times more. And it's an old German violin. Now, both violins are full-sized, but if I compare them side by side, you'll realize that my performance violin is actually a bit larger. And this is because my performance violin is actually an 8/8 violin, while my other violin here is actually a 7/8 violin. Now, obviously, there are pros and cons to both. For example, the 7/8 violin will probably be easier to play for most players because it's a bit smaller. On the other hand, it's much easier to dig and gain better sound from an 8/8 violin. So now I want to compare both violins on their own. But before I do that, I do want to point out that I do have different strings on both violins, and I've chosen the strings that work best and sound the best on both of them. So we want to compare both violins at their best condition. So before I start talking about my performance violin, I will point out that I will play a piece on both violins later so you can compare the two violins, the two extremes, and see the differences. Now, you may be thinking, do more expensive violins always mean they're better? Well, usually it's a good indication, but the difference between an $11,000 violin and a $12,000 violin can often depend on the player. It really depends on what sort of style you're looking for and the sort of sound you're looking for in a violin. Now, of course, I mentioned that my performance violin is an older violin. Now, why would I want an older violin, unlike most things in the world that you want to be brand new? Well, in an older violin, the wood often sounds better, it resonates better, and you can dig in and get more resonance and depth out of the violin. But does it mean that a 1,000-year-old violin is better? Well, no, because you have to realize that there is a peaking point for each violin, and it usually happens about 200-300 years after it's manufactured. Having said that, however, there are many new modern techniques that can allow modern instruments to reach that peak a bit earlier. So next I want to talk about my cheap violin. So as you can see, this is my cheap violin that is brand new. As I mentioned earlier, there are multiple reasons why you don't want a brand new violin. For example, it doesn't resonate as well, you can't dig in as much. But I also want to point out that I personally have a performance violin from Italy, and it's a Cremona violin, which is one of the best cities that Italian violins can come from, and it resonates very beautifully. So it doesn't mean that all new violins are necessarily bad, but it's simply a generalization. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play a piece on both violins. It's actually an excerpt from Think of Me in Phantom of the Opera. And I want you guys to listen carefully and see different characteristics and the differences between the two violins. And from that you should be able to tell the difference between a really expensive violin and the cheap, crappy piece of violin that is brand new. So I'm going to start out by playing on my cheap violin, and I just want to point out the strings I have used. I have a G-D A string from dominant, and my E string is actually a golden E from a parastro obligato. And this is actually the same set that Hilary Hahn uses. Now, what I want you to be listening for is obnoxiously loud sound. It's piercing bright, and it's not soft that you prefer in a violin. So next, I'll play the same piece on my performance violin. Hopefully, through the recording, you can hear that the sound quality on this violin is much better, and there is no hissing sound or buzzing sound. Also, while it is bright, it is not piercing and obnoxious like the other violin. And lastly, I just want to note that on this violin, I'm using a full set of parastral obligato strings, and it contains a golden E string. And this will be the last comment I make on violins, and hopefully the two extremes can speak for themselves and guide you in making a decision if you're choosing a new violin. So the next section I want to talk about is picking the right bow for you. If you are just beginning with the violin, then I wouldn't concern myself too much on this topic. Sadly, I do have to say I do not have a cheap bow, so I won't be able to demonstrate to you and compare the difference between a more expensive bow or a cheaper bow. The two bows I have are actually not very expensive. The two of them are approximately a couple $100 each, so it's not as expensive as many performers have. I have a light bow here on my right hand and a heavier bow on my left. So as you can see, the light bow actually is round around the edges, and the heavier bow is actually 8-sided. I'm not sure if you can actually see the details on the video. Now, there are benefits to both types of bows. The lighter bow is better for playing light pieces if you have spiccato. The heavier bow is actually better if you're playing with a whole orchestra and you don't want to work as hard to project. And it is also very, very nice if you are trying to play a large concerto. Also, if you're trying to really, really dig into the G string and want a rich, full sound, it would be much, much easier to do with the heavier bow. Like I said earlier, if you're just beginning, it's fine if you just have one bow because it will probably do you suffice. However, if you are performing consistently, then two different types of bows would be really suitable for you depending on the circumstance. Now, having said the characteristics of the bows, you do have to realize that we have to apply rosin to the bows, and different types of rosin can also affect the characteristic of the bow itself. For example, I carry two types of rosin. I have a stickier, heavier type of rosin for digging in deeper for the rich notes. And then I have a lighter type of rosin, which is great for the bright sounds that I want to produce. So it really depends on the piece that I am going to perform, and on top of that, I would choose a bow I feel is most suitable, and also the rosin that I feel is most suitable. Lastly, I just want to talk about choosing the right strings for you. Before I get into that though, I do want to point out that I'm not trying to advertise for a certain brand, a certain type of strings, or certain type of rosin. I'm just trying to give an opinion based on what I've experienced. So I just want to say that I won't be demonstrating this on my violins because one, it's really painful having to change all the strings to demonstrate something rather simple, and also because I don't feel like my camera would be able to pick up the sound difference well enough for you all to see. So let's get into strings. I have in my hands the two types of strings I use most commonly, the dominants and the obligatos. So for the everyday beginner, I would suggest using dominants because these are the type of strings that work on most violins and they work rather well. I used these strings for almost 12 years before I started trying different types of strings, and they work perfectly. They may not be able to produce as deep or as resonating a sound as some of the higher end strings, but they work very well for everyday practice needs, and also they are better for the everyday wear and tear. On the other hand though, if you have a really bright violin, you don't want to put very bright strings on it, nor do you want to put dull strings on a dull violin. So in my case, I have a really bright performance violin, so I don't want to put bright strings like the Ava Prazzi. Therefore, I choose to use the obligato because it's juicier and it allows me to dig into the strings a lot more and milk it for what I want to hear in the music. So this is my choice, and especially because it has a golden E, which really resonates the whole violin when you play it. Not only in harmony, but when you play lower octaves within a chord, it sounds super nice. So that's what my opinion is in terms of strings, bows, and violins. Like I said earlier, everything is trial and error, so I encourage you to try everything before you settle down on a type of strings or violin or bow. As always, if you like my opinions, feel free to subscribe to me on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter. And as always, if you have any comments, feel free to leave them below to give me some suggestions about what you would like to see in the future. And that's it guys, Alan signing off.